Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andra Gillespie. I am the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. And on behalf of the staff and the visiting fellows of JWJI, I would like to welcome you to today's Race and Difference Colloquium session. Before we begin today's session, I want to just alert you to some events that are coming up this week, and I hope that you will attend those. So on Thursday, April 1st, we have our annual James Weldon Johnson Distinguished Lecture. We couldn't do this one last year because of COVID, but we're really happy to invite Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham of Harvard University to be our keynote speaker this year. You can check our website for registration details and other things. And also, this is the second installment this Friday of our partnership with Emory College in the first Fridays at 4 series, where we introduce new faculty to Emory who are doing work on race. And so this Friday, we are happy to have Dr. Rocio Zambrana from the philosophy department, who's going to be talking about debt in Puerto Rico and colonialism. So without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker. We're very pleased today to have Dr. LaGina Gause with us. Dr. Gause is an assistant professor of political science at the University of California, San Diego. She earned her PhD in public policy and political science from the University of Michigan in 2016. And in 2017-2018, she was a democracy postdoctoral fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Gause's research interests are at the intersection of US political institutions and political behavior, with a focus on race, ethnicity, and politics, inequality, and representation. She is finishing her book now, tentatively titled The Advantage of Disadvantage, Costly Protest and Legislative Behavior, and she's going to be speaking about that today. This book demonstrates that protest is a valuable political tool for politically marginalized groups. And she finds that legislators are most supportive of protests by disadvantaged populations, including Black, Latinx, and low-income protesters. Her research has been published, among other places, in the British Journal of Political Science and Political Behavior. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. LaGina Gause.
Thank you, Dr. Gillespie, for having me today, and for all of you for coming to this presentation. I am now sharing my screen, I believe. Okay, so here we go. So today I am going to present to you some work from my book, The Advantage of Disadvantage. And it's a book about protests and collective action. Those are two terms I'm going to use interchangeably today. And there's been lots of examples of protests and collective action in the last year, right? So Black Lives Matter protests, strikes for the Fight for 15, so raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, immigration protests, things around climate change, closing the shutting down for the pandemic, and even the Capitol riots that happened in January of this past year. But when you think about collective action, it has a long tradition in the United States, right? And the US government was actually born out of protests when American colonists decided to revolt against the British control over the US colonies, American colonies, out of concern for taxation, and particularly for the way that the British Parliament was running the government without any representation of the American colonists' interests in the British Parliament. And collective action events like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party led to the American Revolution, where the American colonists were able to actually win the revolution and establish its own country. When talking about why they wanted to overturn British rule, they wrote the Declaration of Independence. And in the Declaration of Independence, they talked about how we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal with certain unalienable rights. And when these rights are not protected by government, then it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it in the way that they were doing against the British rule in the American colonies. The founders of the US Constitution also protected the right of collective action and protests in the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights to the US Constitution, when it said that it's the right of people to peacefully assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. So anytime people have some type of issue or concern, it's the right of the people to be able to protest. But while the people who wrote the Constitution wanted people to be able to engage in collective action and protests and have be able to freely express their concerns, they were also concerned about people who, whether they were a large part of the population or small part of the population, had interests, passions, grievances that were contrary or adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the interests of the aggregate community. They're really concerned about people whose passions would have been antithetical, I guess, to a democratic governance. So they created a republic, right? So it wasn't just one person, one vote, but they wanted to have this representative body of people who are elected into office and who can discern which interests should be represented at certain times, so that the interests that were protested or expressed through collective action weren't necessarily the ones that were put into legislation or represented by the government. And so they had this representative body, these representatives who were supposed to have this unbiased representation of the popular will. But we would look at this in practice, the way that representation has happened in the United States is that it tends to represent people who are white more so than people of color, and people who are more economically elite. So people who have more money, who own businesses, are more likely to have their interests represented in government than those who are lower class and lower income and middle class. Part of this may be due to the ability of people to make demands on institutions, right? So I talked about how protest is one way to do it. Another way is through the right to vote, right? But when we look at the right to vote, this is this legally constituted right of people to, in some type of periodic fashion, decide who their elected representatives would be in order to decide the interests that would be represented in government. But at the founding of the US government, all but one state limited the right to vote to white property owning males, which means every other type of person in the US didn't have the legal right to actually decide the people who would determine the laws that would influence their lives, or the people who would determine which interests would be represented in government. Over time, collective action and protests have been responsible, at least in part, for expanding the right of people to vote and to be able to express their preferences in government. First, there was the expansion of voting rights to white men without property, then to African-American men with the Reconstruction Amendments, then to women, Native Americans. And then after the Civil Rights Movement, there was the protecting of those voting rights with the Voting Rights Act. But while collective action has been used to expand rights for people, it's also been used to limit rights representation, right? So collective action like Jim Crow laws instituted by government officials to keep Black people from participating in government, and also things like the Ku Klux Klan engaged in a lot of collective actions to suppress people's rights socially and politically to their freedoms, and then voter ID laws more recently. And then even recently, I'm speaking today at Emory, so Georgia's passing these laws to limit the right of people to participate in elections, right? So collective action is used both in ways to make it more likely that people can have their interests represented in government, but also has been used in ways to make it so that people's rights and interests are suppressed. So this project is about understanding who benefits the most from collective action, right? There's this tug of war that's been existing since the United States has been created, and continues to exist even more recently. Who are the groups most likely to benefit from those collective action efforts in the way that interests are represented in government? And does this collective action lead to more democratic representation where there's less of a bias towards the rich and towards white people in terms of the types of policies that we get in government? And so my argument that I'm going to give you some theory and evidence behind today is that protest is most effective for the groups who have fewer resources and for the groups who engage in costly protests. And when I talk about costly protests, I mean protests that is more likely to face things like state repression, things that are more difficult to participate in. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And then I also argue that protests might actually improve democratic representation. And I'll before I conclude my comments, I'll discuss why there's a maybe or a might behind that part of the argument. So in thinking about why protests might be more effective for disadvantaged groups who normally don't see their interests represented in government, it begins by looking at the motivations of legislative behavior, right? So the motivation of legislators who are responsible for representing certain interests in Congress or other elected offices. So if you think about a legislator, their ability to make policy, to do their job as legislator depends on their ability to be elected and then reelected, right? So this theory begins with the understanding that legislators are very concerned about reelection. They may also care about like making policy for people they care about or for other types of things for doing the goodwill of the people. But in order to do any of those things, they have to be reelected. So they are often looking for the types of interests that are really important to their constituents. They want to be able to represent the people who have interests that will determine how they're going to vote in their next election, right? So it's not the case that everyone cares about every single policy such that a legislator should only look at kind of the median voter or the majority public opinion, but there are certain interests where certain segments of the population have have more interest in. So the legislators want to know what those interests are, because those are the interests that are probably going to determine the outcome of their reelection effort. So move too fastly through that. So because they're interested in responding to people with salient interests, things that are really important to them, they want to look at people who are protesting, because protesting usually happens among people who really care about a particular issue, or it could, right? The issue about protesting is that certain people can protest more freely than other people. So we can think about this kind of graphically, where here on the y-axis, there's a probability that you're going to see a group engaging in protest. And here on the x-axis is how important a particular issue is for that group. So for low resource groups who don't have a lot of money, it makes it difficult for them to afford the transportation to protest, or who aren't really politically engaged because they're worried about other things like making sure they have food on the table for their kids or a roof over their head. Protest is a lot less likely in general, because in general, they have other demands that are really important to them, or even if they were wanting to protest, there are a lot of things that prevent them from being able to do so. But when they really care about an issue, right? So if they really are concerned about putting food on the table, then they may risk something like a strike that could result then in losing their job, because losing their job may be nothing compared to the fact that the job that they have isn't enough to actually put food on their table. So they're more willing to protest as the concern for the issue increases, where otherwise you're not likely to see a lot of protest or collective action from them. Comparatively, high resource groups may be able to protest regardless of their issue salience. So you might imagine a group who because of a flexible working schedule, they're able to get off work in order to protest. Instead of, they're not punching a clock where someone's guarding their time. They can reallocate their workday perhaps to protest and then work at a later time or on the weekend. Or perhaps they're able to protest because their friends are protesting. So it's a lot easier to protest, even if they don't particularly care about the issue that's being raised. So when you see protests by higher resource groups, you're not sure if they actually care enough about the issue that it's going to determine how they'll vote in the election. They may care about it somewhat, but it may not be the issue that will define how they're going to vote in the future. So because of this, when legislators see protests by low resource groups, they know that the issue that that's being protested is one that is very important for them. Comparatively, for high resource groups, there's more uncertainty about how intensely those preferences are for the people who are participating. And for low resource groups, it could also suggest new information, right? So if you're facing a lot of demands on your time, or there's a lot of things that are just keeping you from being able to participate in politics more generally, then perhaps you're not voting. Perhaps you don't have the money to donate to campaigns. Perhaps you don't have the time to volunteer. Then when you do protest, it suggests new information that legislators may not have already about issues that are really important to groups. So the theory that I'm proposing is that the resources that a group brings to be able to participate in a protest can be a proxy, can be a way of understanding how important an issue is for that group when those issues are raised during protests, right? So to test this theory, I used a data set called the Dynamics of Collective Action data set, which was put together by sociologists who looked at the New York Times for any instance of collective action. And so collective action is broadly defined as any time you have multiple people in a public space expressing a grievance or a concern, talking about something that is really important to them. And so I look at only 1991 to 1995 for this data set. And instances, examples of collective action under this definition include things like rallies or marches, also like vigils or information distribution, like signing petitions, letter writing campaigns, emails contacting legislators, also riots or mobs, and then things like boycotts or strikes. So it's a very expansive definition of lots of different types of ways that people can, in community, express their grievances or concerns. I only look at civil rights, minority issues, and civil liberties because this is the most common topic that people protest about. And I only look at liberal claims because I wanted to look at things that were very similar to each other. So when we're talking about civil rights and civil liberties, you're probably wondering, what are those, right? So the most common thing that exists within that category in the data set that I'm looking at are protests for or against abortion. Also things for or against like hate crimes. So people either committing hate crimes or protesting hate crimes that have occurred. And then civil rights for various groups, including LGBT groups, African Americans, Latinos, and a lot of different groups who are protesting for or even to suppress other people's civil rights. And then I'm looking at whether the protests that occur actually influences the types of the way that legislators vote on issues raised during protests. So I look at the US Congress and I try to find for each issue that was raised during a protest, is there a bill that was proposed by the Congress that legislators voted on with respect to that issue, and how did a legislator vote? Did they vote to support the issue raised during protests or against it? And so the first thing I want to know is, did the protests in itself make a difference? So I look at whether the legislators' vote was aligned with the interests of protesters or not. And I compared that to whether it was aligned to the interests of people who didn't protest. And so for the people who didn't protest, I looked at the American National Election Study, which is a really popular, expansive national representative survey that asks lots of questions about American citizens and the way that they think about policies. And I looked specifically at those related to how important civil rights and civil liberties issues were for different groups on particular issues. And then after I looked at whether protests mattered, I also looked at how resources mattered. And I looked at 4 different types of resources. The first is race or ethnicity. So I considered white protesters as those representing high resource groups. And then I looked separately at Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans as lower resource groups due to the fact that people of color tend to have lower incomes. They tend to also face more state repression. So you're more likely to see police at events that that people of color participate in compared to white people. You're more likely to see arrests. And then if you're dealing with immigrant populations, the fact that arrests could result in deportation or even more what am I trying to say? Surveillance by police on certain communities if you're a person of color compared to white. So that's the first resource disparity I look at. I also look at income. So I compare whether the protesters were identified as being low income or homeless to people who didn't have that classification. So it's very unlikely that the New York Times or any newspaper really would identify as a group as being middle-class protesters unless it was specifically around an economic policy. So if there was no indication of income, I calculated that as a higher resource group. For organizational capacity, I compared whether there was a formal interest group or social movement organization present. So an organization like the NAACP, ACLU, Black Lives Matter even, well, not in this data set, Black Lives Matter wasn't a thing in the 90s, compared to whether there was no organization at all. And then I looked at the type of protest. So I split that, I showed you that box of different types of protests, like marches, rally strikes. So I compared things that were more extra institutional. So things that are less conventional and kind of outside of US institutions. I compared that to more institutional tactics like letter writing campaigns, lobbying, and petitions. And so the reason I looked at institutional tactics as higher resource and extra institutional as lower resource is because people who participate in more institutional tactics tend to also have more education and income, or have been in formal institutions that kind of teach people how to engage in lobbying behavior or do letter writing campaigns or participate in petitions, at least in the 1990s, whereas people who are doing extra institutional tactics tend to have lower resource capacity in general. So those are the different types of resources I look at. And when you look at them by issues, you see that white protesters, the two top issues that they're protesting about are for and against abortion and for and against LGBT civil rights, or civil rights for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities. Whereas Black, Latino, and Asian American protesters, the top issues that they're protesting about are civil rights for their group. Looking at income level, higher income protesters are very similar to the larger data set, where abortion and civil rights are the top issues that they're talking about, where lower income protesters are talking about civil rights for disability communities and Latino communities. Whether there's a formal interest group present doesn't seem to matter in terms of the types of issues that they're talking about. So abortion, civil rights are the top issues, regardless of whether there's a formal interest group present or not. And then if you're looking at extra institutional tactics compared to institutional ones, so extra institutional tactics are the most common types of collective action that are engaged in the data set. And however, when you look at the types of issues within those, the top three for each of these categories are very similar. So they're abortion, civil rights for African Americans, and civil rights for LGBT communities. And then the last thing that I also include in these models is characteristics of the legislator and of a district. So I wanted to know whether the voting behavior that I see is attributable to the protests or other things like the legislator's party, their ideology, their race, gender, or even the composition of the legislator's district. So looking at how democratic the district was, or how liberal the district, how educated the district is. Are those what are more likely to determine how the legislators are voting compared to their resources of protesters or protest behavior? So after I do the models, the empirical models, I come up with results that I'm going to demonstrate in this figure, which is basically if this dashed line at the zero line here is going to be kind of the indicator of whether my theory about whether legislators supporting low resource groups more than high resource groups is actually accurate, right? So if you see a bar graph above this line, there's support for the theory. Legislators are supportive of protests, particularly those by low resource groups. If it's below the line, then it's more likely to support higher resource groups, which is more similar to the way that legislative behavior is more generally, the way we normally see legislators represent interests. And then if there's a line that overlaps this zero line, if there's a vertical line overlapping the horizontal zero line, then there's really no support either way. So the first thing I find is that legislators tend to be about 10% more likely to support issues that are raised during protests than those are raised otherwise. So protest seems to influence how legislators vote on legislation, and more so than not protesting. Next, legislators are more likely to support Black and Latino groups than they are white protesters on legislation right after the protests. I also find somewhat of a difference for Asian American protesters compared to white protesters. However, I'm not really sure if this is due to the data or something we would observe outside of the data, because there were very few protests by people of Asian descent in this data set. I do find that low-income groups are more likely to be supported than higher income groups when they're protesting. And I don't find much of a difference for whether there's a formal interest group or whether it's extra institutional versus institutional. So that graph pretty much shows two things. First, legislators are responsive to protests. When they see protests, they're more likely to support protests, the issues raised during protests. And they're also more likely to support the groups who have fewer resources, who are facing higher barriers to participation because they don't have the resources to be able to participate more freely compared to higher resource groups. But one thing you might be asking is whether this is true for all legislators or just kind of the average legislator, because the figures that I show look at generally the average legislator. So one way that we might understand this is like partisanship. Does a legislator's political party influence how they're going to respond to protests? We do know that Democrats tend to be known as the party of civil rights, so maybe they're more likely to be supportive. And then looking at, especially considering I'm looking at liberal civil rights issues, Republican legislators have less incentive to support any type of liberal civil rights issue, regardless of whether it's a higher resource group or a low resource group. So this may lead us to expect that Democrats, and maybe not Republicans, are going to be supportive of protests, particularly by lower resource groups. And I do find that Democrats are generally more likely than Republicans to support protest claims. However, I find that legislators of both parties are more likely to support low resource groups than high resource groups, right? So Democrats and somewhat Republicans are more responsive to Black protesters than white protesters, and both Democrats and Republicans are more responsive to Latino protesters than Black protesters. So while partisanship may influence how strongly how strongly some legislators, in this case Republicans, respond to protest claims, it does demonstrate that Republicans are also more responsive to Black and Latino protesters than they are to white protesters. Next, you might wonder whether race or ethnicity matters, right? So perhaps Black legislators, because they already represent Black issues more often than their counterparts, then maybe they are less likely to demonstrate some type of additional benefit for groups who engage in protests, right? And then there's also the concern that because Black legislators are mostly Democrats, and they tend to vote in general more liberally than other legislators, then you may not have much of a difference in their, and they may not demonstrate much of a difference in their support of liberal civil rights issues. Whereas white and Latino legislators, they vary in their partisanship and their ideology. They're more likely to be Republicans and conservatives than Black legislators are. So perhaps the way the legislators' race or ethnicity might influence how they respond to protests. And I do find that Black and Latino legislators are less likely to support protest claims more generally. However, regardless of a legislator's race or ethnicity, they all tend to be more likely to support low resource groups than high resource groups. So Black or Latino protesters and white protesters, though there's one exception. So Mexican American Democrats, or there was, I think, one or two legislators who identified as Mexican American in the data set. They were more likely to support protests by white issues expressed by white protesters than Latino protesters in this data. So there was one exception where a legislator's race or ethnicity did seem to matter. Then what about electoral security, right? So if you remember the figure with the circles where I talked about how legislators are really concerned about being reelected, right? So some legislators may be more concerned about that than others, right? So if you barely won the previous election, then perhaps you are more eager to support or more eager to find the constituents in your district who really care about certain issues. And maybe that would make you more responsive to low resource groups and high resource groups compared to other legislators who may feel more secure in their reelection. I don't find that to be the case, right? So here are some figures similar to the one with the horizontal line here that shows anything above this line is support for the theories that low resource groups are more likely to be supported than high resource groups. And so as you move to the right in each of these figures, it shows legislators who are perhaps more secure in their reelection because they won by larger vote margins, whereas those on the left side of these figures probably barely won their past election, but you see that there's not really a large increase in whether that influences their support of Black or Latino protesters compared to white protesters. So it seems all legislators have some type of concern about reelection or some type of motivation based that could be related to their desire to be reelection that is influencing how they support issues raised during protests. So to summarize the finding to this point, I find that legislators, again, are responsive to protests, particularly those by groups with fewer resources. And this is typically not conditional on the legislator's characteristics. So whether their partisanship, their race or ethnicity, or their electoral security, right? And so as I started, I talked about that I'm presenting you today is part of a book project, right? So here's an overview, I guess, of the book. So in the first chapter, I talk about the history of collective action and inequalities in the United States. So I talk about how the US was founded in protest, kind of the way I started this, but then talk about how inequalities tend to still pervade the way that representation occurs, and describe kind of what collective action is and what that matters why that might matter for legislative behavior. The second chapter, I give the theory of collective action and representation. So why might legislators be responsive to collective action? I go in more detail about kind of the incentives, the reasons that motivate legislators to respond to particular groups. And also I go a bit into what collective action is and using sociology literature and also some in political science about collective action and protest behavior and social movements as well. The third chapter, I do a survey of legislators and staffers, right? So I also look at legislative staffers because in a lot of times they're the ones who make a lot of decisions. They're the ones who constituents interact with on a day-to-day basis when they reach out to legislators. And so I ask them lots of questions about, like, what do you think of when you see protests? What do you actually think that some groups face more barriers or more costs of participating in protests than others? And I do find that they say that legislators, that they are responsive to protests. They think that they respond to issues raised during protests. They also say that they do see differences in the ways that people are able to participate, and where some groups it's more difficult to protest than others. And they also say that they are more likely to support protests by low resource groups than high resource groups. So chapters 4 and 5 are in large part of what I presented today. So the results looking at the difference between protests and no protests and different protesting groups. But I also talked about whether these results are consistent given the size, media attention, or disruptiveness of protests. So if you look at the social movements literature, they talked about how protests, or in the political science literature as well, how protests as they increase in size are more likely to influence legislative behavior. Or if you get more media attention, how that's more likely to influence the way legislators respond to protests. And then perhaps because of the ability of protests to disrupt businesses or just society more generally, you might see legislators responding to protests in an attempt to return things back to normal, right? So I look at each of those and see that even as the size of protests or the number of times the media talks about an event or even how disruptive it is, even while considering those things, I still find support that legislators are more likely to support costly protests than less costly protests. And then in the last empirical chapter, I talked about in this presentation how the data that I relied on for the results I showed were from the 1990s. So I put together this original data set of protests from 2012 for two reasons. First, I wanted to see how the internet matters in the way that legislators are able to understand protests, right? So protesting online is a lot less costly than protesting in person. And so I do find that legislators are less likely to support issues that are protested about online and those that are protested in person. So like internet action, digital activism is less effective than real world activism. But even while that exists, there are still various barriers that exist to participating online that makes it still the case that when you are participating in online collective action, low resource groups are more likely to be responded to than higher resource groups. The second reason I look at this data set is because I wanted to know whether the New York Times was representative of other newspapers or protests outside of New York, DC area in Los Angeles, which are covered more in the New York Times and other areas in the US. So I went to the top 20 cities, the top 20 most populated cities in the US. I found their largest newspaper and looked at each of those newspapers, collected all of the data, all of the instances of collective action in those newspapers to see whether the same results existed when I looked at other parts of the United States. And I find that the results are generally consistent regardless of the location. And then in the last chapter, I talk about how we should consider each of these results when thinking about inequality more broadly, recent social movements and recent collective action events. And I had met with some of the fellows earlier today, and I talked about how I started this chapter with a discussion of the Boston Massacre. So if you're aware of the Boston Massacre, it was an event in Boston where British soldiers were protecting the king's money, and some American colonists kind of engaged in some conflict happened where the British soldiers ended up firing into the crowd, killing about 8 people. One of those people was Crispus Attucks, who was a man of Indian or Native American and Black descent. And when the trial of the British soldiers were taking place, Samuel Adams, I think, was the lawyer representing the British troops. And he defended the actions of the British soldiers by saying, look, there was this big, dark-skinned Black dude at this event, and he was very scary. He might have been unarmed, doesn't matter. But the fact of the matter is, like, he provoked his image, his mere presence provoked the soldiers so much that it justified them firing on the audience, the crowd. And so this really talks about how, like, even the tropes that we're still dealing with today about how people of color are more deserving, I guess, of violence by police forces because they are more intimidating, like that frame has a long history in the United States, right? And it's one that continues to shape the way that groups are represented and the way that the groups are able to participate in politics. So this kind of shapes the way of, like, this question of whether protest actually improves democratic representation, right? So while I find that protest is more likely to result in public policies that benefit groups who are typically not able to gain representation as often as their counterparts, I also find that it may only minimally influence democratic representation. So what I mean there, right? So low resource groups do find their interests represented more often than high resource groups, but the cost that they face to gain that representation is very real, right? So protesting knowing that you might have police who are going to show up aggressively at that protest is a very traumatizing and physically demanding and maybe even economically costly thing if you're arrested at an event and then have to then therefore if you're held without bond or the price of bond is high, maybe you lose your job or have to pay an economic expense that you weren't prepared for. Or just the psychological trauma of like when your event is then popularized, or sorry, not popularized, when your event is then discussed by the popular media, it's more likely to be characterized as kind of a violent, illegitimate type of act, whereas you know that the same types of events, even more aggressive events by white people are called patriotic, right? So white people wearing months of wearing weapons at a state capitol is called a militia being very patriotic, whereas people of color without weapons protesting are called violent or illegitimate or disruptive, right? So those costs of protesting are very real. And then the way that the representation that I'll look at, right, are roll call votes, which are strategic and even sometimes symbolic ways of representing groups, right? So I look at bills that were already on the legislative agenda so that they aren't necessarily addressing specifically or reacting specifically to an event, even if they are supporting the issue that it's raised, right? So it's not really challenging, I guess, the status quo, right? It's providing some type of minimal representation that may not actually address the get to the crux of the issue that's raising the protests. So in order for there to be a substantial change, a substantial policy change, protest has to demonstrate a very strong electoral threat, right? So the reason that you saw all of the police departments and local city councils starting considering things like defunding the police or reparations was because you had an organization, Black Lives Matter, who had not just participated in 2020, but had been staging protests for almost a decade, about 7 or 8 years, and had been organized and demonstrating that that if their issues weren't being represented, that they could run other candidates, right? You saw Cori Bush running in the electoral office. She won the office to become a U.S. representative after having participated in protests in her local community, right? So that there was this strong electoral threat that if you didn't respond to the protests, then the Democratic Party might have faced some strong electoral threats from more progressive candidates. And you have the same thing in Republicans too, right? So Republican candidates who are very concerned about, say, the Tea Party or more recently, some of these more ideologically conservative candidates who are running for office, if the legislators who were more moderate didn't respond to those protesters, they were more likely to lose their seats, right? So protest does lead to some substantial policy change, but in a lot of ways, only when it's able to demonstrate that there's a strong organization, a strong network behind that protest. And finally, like, even though protests, the costs of protesting are real and the symbolic representation sometimes is discouraging, protest does demonstrate the agency of marginalized groups to advocate for themselves and gain some type of representation, right? So a lot of times when we talk about the way that marginalized groups are able to gain representation, sometimes it's talked about as some like good willing, like business person or some some like foundation or somebody doing things for marginalized groups. This research shows that marginalized groups can demonstrate for themselves and gain representation for themselves. Not necessarily that that's the only way that it happens, but it just shows that they have agency and can gain representation and get some addressing of their grievances. So that is my talk, right? So that is my research on representation and legislative behavior. I think at this point,
I will start asking questions.
Yeah. Sorry, I was a little confused because I saw that there were some
questions. I'll ask them. Yeah.
Okay.
So the first question I want to ask is a data clarification question.
Yes.
So in the data set that you showed from the New York Times archive, is that nationwide or is it just New York region specific? And what are the total number of collective action events captured in the data?
Yes, good question. The New York Times is a national newspaper, right? But it tends to overrepresent events occurring in New York, in Los Angeles, and in the DC area, right? So that doesn't mean it doesn't represent things that happen in other areas, but it tends to overrepresent those. The size of the protests, I believe there are about like 200 to 300 per year. I don't have that data on me right now, though.
Okay, then. Thank you. Yeah, so whoever wrote that question, if you have any follow-up questions based on that, please feel free to put them in the chat. We already have in the Q&A, so I already have questions in the Q&A and in the chat, and so I'm just going to toggle back and forth between them. So the first question is from one of our fellows, Francine Allen. Thank you for this detailed discussion of collective action. I'm wondering, when you speak about legislators being more supportive of low-resource protesters, can you explain what supportive means or looks like in your discussion? I'm simply trying to understand how substantive this legislative support is.
Yeah, so the two examples I can think of are, so I talked about how abortion was a really popular, or one of the most common issues in the late 1990s. So support, or the early 1990s, support for abortion would be in federal legislation, and every year there's an appropriation bill that says that the US government will not support any types of institutions that give money towards abortion, right? So this would be in opposition to groups who are more pro-choice and want more funding for abortion. Or there were also protests around like MLK Day either in support of Martin Luther King or more white supremacist groups who were in opposition to having a Martin Luther King Day. That was another kind of line item in an appropriation bill that the US government would support having a national holiday for Martin Luther King holiday. So those are generally the types of bills you have, where it's like a bill considering lots of things. Another type of thing that comes up consistently in legislation at the congressional level are community policing legislation. So it varies somewhat from year to year, but there's usually some bill that has a section that talks about how funds will be distributed to address community policing to improve relations within different kind of local areas. So those are the types of bills that come up here. And there are very few. I think there was one legislation that was put forth in response to the Rodney King protests. And so there was a bill that appropriated funds to address the property damage and to distribute money towards businesses in response to protests in LA, Chicago, and other areas that were affected by the Rodney King collective action events.
Thank you. So the next question is from Barbara Combs, another one of our fellows. First, thank you so much for sharing the Crispus Attucks story. It was revelational to hear you talk about how long this radicalized frame that presents Black bodies as scary and deserving of punishment has existed. Can you talk a little bit more about your methodology? I know you wanted to look at liberal thought. What are the strengths and weaknesses of using the New York Times?
Yeah, so one of the things about using the New York Times is that the New York Times is more liberal, but it also has this kind of geographic focus. So you're only getting certain types of legislators in the data, which is why when I did the original data set, I looked at more locations. And with that 2012 data, I wish I had the maps here. I don't. It's protests in on a larger range of U.S. cities. I think like still the most popular were events covered in New York, LA, DC, but then also you had some in the Midwest. So there were a bunch in like Texas. So you asked about the liberal tent. So part of that is, yes, the New York Times is more liberal than other newspapers, so probably not the most liberal newspaper. Expanding the number of newspapers also gave me more of an ideological range. And I also say that for my main analyses, I look at the just liberal protests, but I do run other analyses looking at only conservative or collapsing liberal and conservative, and the results are still pretty consistent. I think they were even stronger in favor of low resource groups when I looked at conservative protests only, which I was kind of surprised by that. And I don't have a theoretical reason for why that would be the case.
Great, thanks. And so a second part to Barbara's question is, I'm thinking of the phrase, all politics is local. Do your conclusions, such as protests does seem to influence a legislator's likelihood to support protest claims, causes, etc., apply at the city, state, and national federal level, or is it only just one of those?
Yeah, so most of the empirical analyses, the data I showed you today was from the federal level, but the survey of legislators and staffers I do, I also look at city council members and their staffers. I tried to find state legislators. I think I found like one, so not many there. So there is coverage on that level as well. And then anecdotally, just kind of looking at the responses to the protests in the last year, a lot of those were on the local and state level, and it took longer. It has been taking longer for the federal government to respond to those, both liberal and conservative protests. So I do agree that a lot of this is local. And part of the reason I looked at the federal level in a lot of ways was because I wanted to have a more conservative test. I wanted to set myself up to not find support for my findings, because if I found it there, I thought it would be stronger if I look at places where you do see more protests and you do see a stronger connection between legislators and their constituents.
Thank you. The next question is from my colleague, Michael Owens in the political science department. How do you think your theory of costly protest improving democratic representation travels? That is, how applicable might the theory be to understanding and explaining legislative behavior in other democracies, especially non-white majority democracies? Also, what about those contexts in the United States where the policy space is dominated less by legislative behavior and more by executive and bureaucratic behavior, so cities with strong mayor systems? What would we have the same expectations, or have you any empirical support for those expectations when looking at mayors or governors?
Yeah, so the first part of the question is, how would this travel? And I think how it travels is, in the most part, when you're talking about the relationship between constituents and elected officials, right? Understanding how resources vary depending on the population is really important. So if you're talking about a place where you're not going to have a majority white population per se, there's still disparities and inequalities that exist no matter where you go in the world, right? And so you really need to understand kind of what those salient cleavages are, those differences are, to understand which populations or how it might influence the data. In terms of mayors and governors, I also think that's similar, right? So they don't create legislation for the most part. I mean, they have like their executive orders or their like unilateral legislation, and they sign off on legislation. So part of it is looking at the type of actions that elected official conducts that constituents can use to hold that elected official accountable, right? So I look here at roll call votes, again, not because I think that's the only place that matters, but because I thought that was a place I would be less likely to find results. But I have another project where I want to look at public statements and like legislators who are actually like not just talking about protests, but also like protesting themselves in support of it. So oh wow, the state legislator who was recently arrested in Georgia for protesting the
Mark Cannon.
Yes, thank you. Right. So like understanding those actions and how that influences legislative or influences the way that constituents view their elected officials' representation of them. Right. So I think those types of other behaviors are also really important to understanding how constituents evaluating the people who are elected to represent them.
Great, thank you. So this question comes from an anonymous attendee. How do you think the growing diversity of protests fits your model? For example, I recently read an article that found that following the death of George Floyd, half of Black Lives Matter protesters were white. Would you consider these protests low resource because they were advocating for Black issues, or high resource because the majority of people at these protests were white?
Yeah, that's an interesting and complicated question. I think the diversity of protesters shows a bigger organizational strength because you're talking about lots of different sub-constituencies. So I don't know how it's costly in the case that like organizing those types of people to participate together for a similar cause is difficult to do and difficult to sustain. I actually have another paper that I'm working on that talks about the diversity of that population and finds that so you had about 20% of the people who were participating in these Black Lives Matter protests last year who actually didn't like believe in Black Lives Matter, like that statement, right? They were protesting because they thought inequality was bad or because they thought they were really frustrated about the way the government was handling the pandemic. And these Black Lives Matter protests who already existed were easy for them to join to express those frustrations, but they weren't necessarily protesting in solidarity with Black Lives Matter and those aims. So then when you saw things like defund the police or reparations and people who were participating in those protests saying that they weren't supportive of those goals, it wasn't that they shifted their support, they just weren't supportive to begin with. So it kind of makes it more difficult to have a cohesive message or strategy when you have a lot of other diversity of people participating in these events, right? So in one way, it shows a stronger organizational strength, but in another, it also throws a more diverse population of people where it makes it difficult to really sustain over time and to have a policy prescriptions that are going to satisfy everyone in such a large coalition.
Thank you. Denise Rayner asks, when you say that political party had little influence, does that mean that the response of Republicans to protest centers around anti-abortion and anti-LGBTQ, and that response tends towards the mean that includes Democrats?
That could very much be the case. I am not sure. Yes, that could be the case. I don't know. I don't have the data for that.
Okay. Well, thank you for your candor with that. If there are any more questions, please feel free to include them in the Q&A. I have a question, and so I'm just going to be a nerd and act like a political scientist, and just ask you who you're in dialogue with. When you were talking, I couldn't help but think about Verber Salzman and Brady's resource mobilization model and thinking about how that actually relates to what you're talking about here. So how are you in dialogue with them? How are you in dialogue with Dan Gillian, who talks about how politicians do respond to protests? And, if you could update it, since it seems like your data ends just before the rise of Black Lives Matter, your theory, can help explain that. But what plans do you have for any empirical testing of this model in a post-2014 kind of world, or even a post-Trump kind of world?
Yeah, so who am I involved? Let me write down the second question because I'm going to forget it. Who am I in dialogue with? So partially I'm in dialogue with social movement theorists who don't as often talk about the political outcomes, right? So if it's done in social movements, it's usually done on like case studies, more particular like understanding of particular moments or of social movements or types of events. Social movement theory also has its own like resource mobilization theory that I think Verber, Salzman, and Brady adapt for the political science audience, where they talk about how it's really important, resources are really important explaining when you might see protests happening, right? So understanding how strong leaders are, or the types of people power that exist within communities, or the role of the media. Like, all of these are resources that can be used to mobilize collective action. And I'm kind of interested in kind of the outcome of that, right? Which is more of the Daniel Gillian type of audience, who is trying to talk about kind of how these how the influence of those. And I think I'm one of the first, though, to meld those research agendas. Even so, in political science, they talk about like this inequality literature that overwhelmingly shows that like white people or rich people, they're the ones whose policies are represented. They're the ones who get the great frames on what they're asking to be what their interests are and how they're trying to get those represented. And I never was okay with that, because I felt like, but there's all of these people I see who are mobilizing for change, who are getting represented. Perhaps we're just looking in the wrong places. If we're only looking at voting behavior, then that's only part of the puzzle. So in a lot of ways, I'm kind of at the intersection of a bunch of literatures and trying to get them to talk to each other. And understanding the post-2012 world. So yeah, I don't really plan to do research updating this project. And part of that is I spent a lot of time on kind of developing the theories so that we can kind of have ways to understand this as time evolves. Even as the project evolved, the world of politics and protests changed drastically. And I still think the theory still holds, even though the data is not updated. But it's less that I'm uninterested in it. It's just that it's a very comprehensive data collection process. It took me 4 years to collect the 2012 data because of all the variables I need to make the models work. And there are better ways to collect protest data, better ways that people are trying to collect protest data, but that still doesn't go beyond kind of where it was, what they're talking about, how many people were there. What I need is kind of who was there beyond just how many people. And that's a lot harder to code. But also, I'm just more interested in other parts of the puzzle, right? So like legislators do more than just sign off on legislation. What else do they do to respond to protests, right? How are people who are participating thinking about their participation? Why are they participating? How are they getting how are they deciding to join certain coalitions? And then also, what's the role of the media, right? So the media also does a similar job in being biased towards low resource groups. So media coverage of protesters is a lot more negative when you see Black or brown people participating than white people. How does that influence the population subjected to that coverage and their willingness to participate in protests? So those are like at least 3 of many projects that I'm working on other parts of this puzzle, so that which is why I'm kind of not as focused on just more data collection here.
Well, how could your data set, kind of speaking that Al Tillery's work, how would it incorporate hashtag activism? And you talked a little bit about sort of the internet and social media and all of those kinds of things, but how could that be incorporated into a data set to test your theory?
Yeah, hashtag. So that's partly the 2012 data, right? So I do have lots of online protests that are occurring. And the bigger finding there is that one, access to the internet and the way the people use internet is still very segregated and in ways that disadvantage communities, right? So the networks of people who participate online are very similar to the networks of people who participate offline. So legislators don't know a lot about Black Twitter, right? They're not really sure about those conversations that are occurring, even though Black people may be very aware of those conversations. So there's still a disconnect between what legislators know and what community members know, right? And even in our discussions of like what was going on in Trump and his supporters and like Parler and like all of these different social media sites that exist, they're still very segregated in ways that it makes it hard to communicate outside of your community to talk about what you want and politically. But I'll also, part of that is why I think I still find findings in support of what I'm saying. So when you can find collective action online, hashtag activism, that does get outside of the community, and lots of people are aware of it, right? It does lead to more support for those communities who aren't being represented. There was another part that I wanted to say to that answer, and I can't remember it now. So,
well, maybe this will jog it, just because as you were speaking, I was thinking of Tillery's sort of finding about Black CBC members' involvement in Black Twitter, in particular Black women legislators, and they seem to be much more involved in doing hashtag activism. And I don't know if they are able to be a bridge to kind of shed light on things that are being discussed on Black Twitter to kind of give it the sort of, imprimatur or, of legitimacy by, then bringing it up on their own feeds or bringing it up in terms of, their participation in oversight hearings and other kinds of activities.
Yeah, I mean, that's a little outside. I feel like this is more on the benefits of descriptive representation for substantive representation, right? So the fact that Congress is becoming more diverse and you have people who are coming out of these communities, either some of them actually from like social movements and collective action, right? Who are now being voices of populations who weren't having someone present who actually understood those interests inherently, and not just because they were communicating what someone told them was what someone else told them matters to people, right? They understood it themselves, right? It makes it easier, or the types of representation that you have, the types of bills that you have, the conversations around certain issues are richer, more diverse, and in ways that can actually benefit communities who didn't have that before, right? So also thinking of like Nick Carnes' work, who does it more on talking about income, but how a lot of the inequality that we see in representation isn't necessarily because legislators just don't like other people, they just don't understand them, right? Most legislators come from backgrounds where they're lawyers or their families are politicians. So that's the community they know. They were former business people, right? So when they're representing these issues, it's because they understand that life because they lived it experientially, right? And when you increase when you increase the representation of other people within Congress who have these connections to these communities because they were members of them and they are members of them, that increases the type of legislation that we get in ways that you don't have just through kind of forcing people to care about you or to think about you.
Great, thank you so much. So I don't see any other questions. So again, I very much want to thank you for this presentation. It was truly fantastic. And I want to just remind people again of next week's talk, and we hope that you can come back for that. So next week, Dr. Jennifer Nash of Northwestern is going to be our speaker. And of course, please remember on Thursday, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, and on Friday, Rocio Zambrana. So with that, I will bid everyone a great afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Take care.